Can you hear me now? That's better. Mr. Dean just said in his introduction a few words about the Raising the Bar programme in the EPO. And really the subject of this talk is a collection of slightly disparate points which seem to me to be important consequences of the Raising the Bar programme, and in particular the revised guidelines for examination which entered into force in June of last year. The EPO wants to be the best patent office in the world. It wants to grant the highest quality patents. They and we, I think, have some differences of opinion as to what high quality means. Clearly, great searching is essential to high quality patents. But as Mr. Dean alluded to, the attitude of examiners in the EPO is difficult, to put it mildly, and they make our life extremely difficult. They are appearing to be unreasonable in many occasions. And they're raising objections that once raised are extremely difficult to overcome. My comments are really aimed at non-European applicants, and I'm just going to pull out some topics which which to me seem to be important in the sense that they reoccur frequently, and also they're important because they can be dealt with at the drafting stage. Again. So these are all points which, once they're raised, you're going to have a heck of a job trying to overcome. But if you are aware of them when you're drafting the spec, then hopefully you'll be able to avoid them in the first place. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about the danger of trying to cover material that the EPO doesn't search initially. I'm going to look at that from the point of view of claims that are too broad to start with, and pulling in amendments from the description that you think are going to be fine but aren't. Essential features. The EPO has a tendency to decide that most of your preferred embodiment is essential and to require you to put it into the claim, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about clarity. Clarity is an objection we get in, I work in the electronics and software field. Just about every case coming in from outside Europe gets clarity objections of some sort on it, and they can be extremely difficult to deal with. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So, restriction on amendment after searching. I'm just going to talk for a minute or so about this in theory, and then give you an example which I think probably illustrates the point a little bit more. But in essence, once the search has been made, you can only amend to subject matter which is encompassed by that search, unless the features are deemed to be not essential to the invention, in which case you may ask why are you amending them to put them in the claim in the first place. And of course that has consequences in your drafting, that if you're not going to claim your invention fully, or you're going to be relying on features, say, from the description, if those features are considered not to be covered by the original search, then you won't be allowed to make the amendment, and your only recourse may be to file a divisional application. And if you've ever done that in Europe, you'll know that is enormously expensive. But I thought that one interesting point to look at was how this can come up if you start off with claims which are really too broad. We all like to draft broad claims. We're all taught to draft broad claims and to get our clients the maximum protection we can do. Sometimes we go a little too broad. What can happen in the EPO is that the EPO will look at your broadest claim, decide it's entirely hopeless, and that any invention you must have must lie in the dependent claims. But they see those to be non-unified, and they raise a lack of unity of invention objection. You then try and amend, but they'll only search, of course, the first of those inventions. You then try and amend to one of the features of the later dependent claims, and you're not allowed to because it's unsearched, and you have to you have to file a divisional. Now, I thought I'd illustrate this with an example, and I have to say, when I prepared this, I thought the audience would be largely Indian and therefore cricket lovers, but actually they're all at home watching India beat England in a one-day international at the moment. I think we've got a couple of Aussies here. For the rest of you who don't understand cricket, bear with me, it's just a patent claim. This is based on a real case, drafted, I say, by an Australian, and hopefully not the gentleman over there. What I've done is taken a perfectly good claim and wrecked it to make my point. This isn't the claim that was actually filed. The point about this claim is it's way too broad. And for cricket lovers here, we all know that shoving a camera in a cricket stump has been around for ages. For any Americans in the audience, I'm not quite sure what the equivalent is, but I guess they're probably cameras inside football goals or on the end of baseball players' noses or something like that. But roughly, this claim is to a camera system for installation on a cricket wicket, comprising stumps, comprising a video camera, a stump having a hollow configured to receive the camera, and a stump opening on a pitch-facing surface of the stump. An optical device positioned in the stump for directing light entering the stump opening towards the camera. And just to paraphrase, you've got a transmitter in there and a processor which spits out a broadcast signal at the end. The cricket-loving fraternity will recognise that that's been around for a long time. If one looks at a couple of dependent claims, you see that there are actually some nice ideas here. So claim 2, or the first claim I've mentioned there, is directed to a second stump, second video camera and second optical device, whereby the processor can process captured data to provide a three-dimensional broadcast. That's beginning to look quite neat. That's something we haven't got before. And the second dependent claim includes a mounting for supporting a camera and the associated optical device within the hollow. The mounting being rotatable about a central axis to turn the camera and the optical device within the hollow. So quite a nice idea, that second one, but actually completely unrelated to the sort of the three-dimensional broadcast idea. And what would be likely to happen if you filed those three claims is that claim 1 would just be discarded as obviously not novel, and claims 2 and 3 would be considered to be, in the light of the closest art, separate inventions, and only claim 2 would be searched. But the consequence is that when you want to amend claim 1 to include the feature of claim 3, you're not going to be allowed to do it. You're going to have to file a divisional to do that because it's unsearched material. Similarly, if you wanted to amalgamate claims 1, 2 and 3, you may find that you wouldn't be able to do it because you're including unsearched material. So lack of unity there is the problem. So a quick drafting tip then is to understand the true scope of your invention when you draft, and to be sensible and realistic about the scope of claim you draft. And of course, if you can, to search carefully before you draft so you're not going to get nasty surprises about the prior art leading to this sort of objection. I said at the beginning that amending from the description can be problematic as well, and just to illustrate that point, if you imagine that feature of claim 3, this rotatable mounting, was not claimed but was just simply mentioned in the description, you'd have exactly the same problem then, that you wouldn't be able to amend as the feature hasn't been searched. The only rider on that is if it was directed to the same problem as the original claim, the same technical problem in the EPO's view, you might be able to include it, but if it was directed to the same problem, then it's unlikely to be forming a basis for inventive step. Clarity. Anyone that practices for the EPO knows Article 84, claims must be clear and concise. But you may be less familiar with the new guidelines, which are the subject of an awful lot of objections we're seeing at the moment. The latest guidelines say that the meaning of the terms of the claim should, as far as possible, be clear for the person skilled in the art from the wording, and I put in bold, of the claim alone. So the wording has to be clear, the meaning has to be clear from the wording of the claim alone. We all, when faced with clarity objections, say the examiner, read the description, it's absolutely clear what's going on. That's not what this guideline says. This guideline says that the claim, when taken on its own, without reference to the description, has to be clear. And I think this guideline is responsible for the enormous increase we've been seeing in clarity objections. And the problem you get with clarity, and I'd be interested from other people here, I know work in different technical fields, but certainly in the electronics field, is that you often find yourself with a clarity objection and you are absolutely stuck. Because the wording that's been used in the claim is very often similar to the wording used in the description, or the wording in the description is a narrow version of what's been used in the claim, and as our next speaker will tell you, if you start amending to that, you have all sorts of difficulties with added matter. If a feature is deemed to be non-essential to the invention, again, I question what it's doing in the claim if it's not essential, you have much more freedom to amend to overcome clarity objections. But if it is an essential feature, you may find yourself extremely restricted as to the amendments you can make to overcome the clarity objection. And simply turning the wording round to conform with the examiner's idea of what is clear may not be possible. And we've seen cases, and certainly is a distinct possibility, where applications can be refused simply on clarity objections. And when I talk about clarity objections, I talk about the sort of language that is entirely acceptable in many other patent offices. So there's a standard for clarity here, which I think is over and above what we see in other patent offices because of this requirement that the claims have to be clear when read alone. So I just put in a few drafting tips for clarity. Avoid non-standard terms. You're going to get into trouble if you're using something not well understood in the field. I find a great tendency for clients when giving us invention disclosures to use terminology that turns out to be their own and no one else uses it. We all had to be very careful not to put that into specifications. I'm going to touch on functional language in a moment. That, certainly in the electronics field, is getting very, very difficult indeed. And imprecise language, relative terms about the longs, the thins, the shorts, the wides, the bigger thans. These are all going to get objections, and you will struggle to overcome them. And so the corollary is do use terminology that's well understood in the art. If you can point to a term being a textbook term, then that certainly is a very good way of dealing with a clarity objection. I mentioned also essential features. Claims must have all the essential features of the invention, and the relevant guideline says that essential features are those necessary for achieving a technical effect underlying the solution of the technical problem with which the application is concerned. Of course, the technical problem in the way the EPO examines can change as the closest prior art is identified, and you may need to include further essential features. But the real problem is what the examiner considers to be an essential feature. And we have seen an enormous increase in examiners saying, well, it's absolutely clear to me that to make this invention work, you have to have features X, Y, and Z from the description. I want to see those all in the claim. And you look at it and think, well, if I accept that, this claim is entirely worthless. It's going to be a narrow claim to a preferred embodiment. So my comment here is bear this in mind when you're drafting. When you're drafting your specific descriptions, do think about what an examiner could construe as being essential. And if a feature isn't essential, make sure that it's absolutely explicit that it's not essential. Say it's not essential. The other point to say there, just go to the next slide, is when you introduce your term, use as many variants as possible. If you are disclosing lots of different variants, then it is much easier to argue that that one particular one that the examiner has honed in on isn't actually an essential feature. So if you can describe multiple examples, then that gives you much better basis for resisting requirements to throw in unnecessary limiting amendments. I think I've got about 2 or 3 minutes would be all right. Yeah, I think so. Functional language is the last point I want to talk about. In computer fields, we live and breathe functional languages. It's just about the only way to claim things very often. Similarly so in electronics, but we are seeing an increased reluctance by EPO examiners to permit functional language. They say that it's not clear, and they point to a guideline that says the invention cannot be defined by the result to be achieved. Now that guideline, in my view, and certainly for the last 20-odd years, has been talking about claims, as a whole, taken as a whole, a claim purely recited in functional terms, has always considered to be unallowable except in extreme circumstances. But what's happening now is that they are looking at claims which are effectively defined as structure, a list of features, some of which are defined in functional terms, and they're objecting to those simply because of the functional elements in those claims. Here are a couple of examples. These are both taken from a case of mine which is pending at the moment, and this is sort of language which would have sailed through no problems a couple of years ago, and is now objected to, and it's a perfectly common objection. The biasing circuit is configured to sink current. It's not exactly a fully functional definition of the entire invention. It's just one feature. Another one, wherein the portion of the amplified signal provided to the amplifier input reduces out-of-band oscillation. So the sort of features that you would quite reasonably want to include to sort of explain what's going on, really. And this is now being objected to, which does make drafting extremely difficult in this field. So they will require you to amend those out and to replace with purely structural features. Now, if your description doesn't have broad language with those features in it, you may be forced into accepting something very, very narrow. And I don't want to anticipate the next talk on added matter too much, but it is a huge problem in the EPO. So I'm going to conclude with just a couple more drafting tips. Really, functional language, bear in mind how very difficult it is in the EPO. Bear in mind that if you had anything functional in your claim at all, you are very likely to get an objection. And make sure that your description is jam-packed full of alternatives, possible languages that you can bring into the description if you have to. You can bring in from the description into the claim. So I think my time is up, and I will then pass on to the next speaker. Thank you very much for listening.